Welcome to the lesson on finding and citing references. The learning outcomes for this lesson are as follows. At the conclusion of this lesson, I would like for you to be able to do the following things. First, explain the purpose of citing references. Secondly, be able to identify appropriate sources of references and be able to avoid citing inappropriate references. Third, I would like you to be able to correctly cite references in your text and in your bibliography or references cited list. And the last one is you should be able to find references in databases and import them into reference managing software. All right, so let's get started. Why do you need to cite references? Anyway, what's the point of citing references in your scientific paper? Well, there are a few different reasons that this is important. The first one is that you need to give credit to those who originally made the discoveries that you are referencing. So just like when you publish your papers, you want authors in the future to cite you when they're talking about your work and how it's important, you need to do the same thing for other authors. So it's just part of the system that we have in science for accrediting authors for their contributions. Another reason to cite references is to help your readers know where to look if they want additional information or if they want to verify what it is that you are writing. In other words, references are a way to direct the readers to specific literature. And another reason to cite references is to reassure readers that you've done your background homework, you know what you're talking about, and that your premise is valid, it's scientifically rigorous, and it has a basis in previously published work. So those are the basic reasons why you need to cite references in your scientific journal article. This is a quote I like to show from Samuel Johnson. He says, "The greatest part of a writer's time is spent in reading. In order to write, a man will turn over half a library to make one book." Now, this doesn't apply only to men, obviously. It's the same for women. So a human will turn over half a library to make one book. The point of me showing you this quote is to show that you're going to have to do a lot of reading to write your paper. You're not going to sit down and write it in isolation. You need to know what has been done before so that you know how your work fits into that context. And so you'll read a lot of papers as you write each of your scientific papers. Now, in terms of references, what types of references should you expect to be citing? So we can refer to references or source material as primary sources, secondary sources, tertiary sources, and there are other sources that can get you started, but they're not acceptable to cite in a scientific paper. So let's look first at primary sources. Primary sources are the original peer-reviewed publications, usually journal articles, but sometimes they'll be published in book chapters. These primary sources will be the bulk of your citations. Secondary sources are review articles in scientific journals. If you're not familiar with a review article, that is an original publication in a scientific journal summarizing and analyzing other literature that has already been published. For example, you might have a review article about diabetes. The authors would read hundreds of papers and they would describe the results from those papers and put it into a logical framework and draw some conclusions about that body of work. And a good review article will come up with new questions, but sometimes review articles are just a summary of what has been done up to that point. Sometimes it's okay to cite these review articles, and we'll talk about when you can cite these secondary sources. Tertiary sources will be cited occasionally. It's not very common. Most journal articles will not have any tertiary sources, but sometimes you will use a tertiary source. So what are these tertiary sources? They include newspaper articles, textbooks, and official or scholarly websites, such as databases from the FDA or rules and regulations from FDA, statistics from the CDC or USDA, World Health Organization, those kinds of facts and figures that you cannot find in a primary journal article. Now, sources like Wikipedia and encyclopedias are not considered to be valid scientific sources. Now, I'm not saying that you should never go look at Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is kind of like a review article in itself, and it can get you started because the articles on Wikipedia typically will cite specific primary sources. So it can be a good way to get started, but you shouldn't cite Wikipedia itself as a source in your journal article. So where do you find these sources, the articles that are going to become your references? One place you can look is the key papers that are related to your work. So you probably have a stack of papers that you are reading as you're doing your research. You can take a look in those papers and see the sources that they are citing. There's a good chance that if it's a source for work in a paper that's closely related to the work that you are doing, that it would be an appropriate citation for you as well. Check there. That's one first place you can go quickly to find some references. Secondly, you can just keep your eyes open as you are browsing, look for announcements, press releases, news articles. You can look on the professional societies' websites. They'll talk about research. If you look at social media like Twitter or LinkedIn, you'll see articles being promoted by their authors or by people that just think it's interesting work. That sometimes I've found a lot of good sources that way. You can look at science news sites, and they will be summarizing research in their articles. You can also search databases. And this is going to be the major way that you find most of your sources. The common databases are Google Scholar, Web of Science, Scopus, and PubMed. And there may be a few others, but these are the big ones that most people are going to be searching as they're looking for references or source material. So now that we've talked about sources of references, let's now discuss what references are appropriate and how you know which reference you should cite in a particular situation. So let's look at an example where I need to cite a primary source. I am going to cite a specific original finding that is critical to my argument. In this example, I want to establish some background knowledge, and that background knowledge is that IRT1 was the first iron transporter gene identified from plants. So that's a very specific statement. I should cite the original paper that first discovered this knowledge, and you can see the citation here, ID et al. 1996. Now this 1996 paper has been cited in a lot of places. It's been cited thousands of times. So could I cite a review article that makes this statement, such as Waters and Sanger in 2011? No, that is not appropriate. That's a secondary source, and I'm making a very specific statement, so I need to cite a primary source. So I should not cite a review article. Now, what about citing a newer article that mentions this finding in its introduction? Can I cite that? For example, Stein and Waters, 2012. Absolutely not. Don't do this. I bring this up because as a reviewer, I started to see this a lot. Authors that were citing other primary papers, using them as a secondary source for a very specific statement. You shouldn't do that. You need to trace back through the literature to the very first original article that discovered this knowledge that you're trying to cite. So here's another example. I want to cite a general finding that's critical to my argument. In this case, I want to say that iron transporter genes are critical for plant iron uptake in multiple species. So that's a general statement. It's not talking about one specific iron transporter. It's talking about a whole category. So I can cite secondary sources for this. If only a few papers have established this fact, What I'll do in that case is cite them all. So if it's less than 4, I'll just cite all 4 of those. If it gets to be 5 or 6 or 7, in that case, I'm going to go over to a review article and cite a review article. Now, in the case that there have been no review articles that are appropriate to make this statement, and there's more than 4 or 5 papers that have been published, then I will just choose the first 2 or 3 chronologically and cite those papers.